Welcome everyone to episode 34 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. We are so excited to have you all tuning in again today when while we pick up our conversation around Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. This week, we're going to be diving into chapter 10, which is labeled Simply White. Very much looking forward to getting that conversation. But first up, of course, just as we have many weeks, we are starting out with my fantastic guests. I'm here, of course, joined with Melissa Ellis and Henri Williams. Thanks to both of you for continuing to be a part of the conversation. A little side note, and that is that we are a little bit behind in the editing and uploading work of this podcast. So do note that we recorded this podcast on May 2nd. So any references you hear to real-time events were happening just that week prior to May 2nd. So just giving you a little bit of context there. But as I said, just like we have for the last several weeks, we're going to kick off with some things that are happening in the world right now that really surface and lift up some of the key ideas that Ibram Kendi brings us throughout the course of his book. And we're going to get started this morning with a topic that's really at the forefront of Henri's mind. So Henri, let's get to it.
Because one of the things that struck me this week, and it's interesting, Melissa, because we talked about your Senator Scott before. I really wanted to cue up a little audio piece.
Okay.
Because as you may know, he did the response after Biden's speech this week.
Yes, he did.
And if any of you heard or read what he said, and then about a day or so later, NPR released a 40-minute interview where he testified in a congressional hearing in support of the reform bills for racial justice against people of color. And during that 40-minute interview, literally talked about being stopped, friends of his having tension with police because they were Black. One of his friends had to buy a cheaper car because they were tired of being stopped. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is here we are, Mr. Scott being a hypocrite in front of the American people. Yeah. Because this week he literally went on record and said, oh, there's no racism in America. Yeah. Everything is fine. To include, and I guess I was just so struck with this idea that we've been fumbling with. Can a person of color be racist? Yes, they can. Yeah. Because everything he said was racist. Yeah. He's in a position of power to really affect that racist belief in some way, shape, or form. And, it just saddens me, when you think about here's our representatives who just continue to lie and support this, these beliefs.
Right.
But yeah, I that's kind of been in the back of my head all week.
Yeah.
It's not the first time either. It's a very common thing. If you are familiar with Candace Owens, who has built her entire platform and social media presence on the idea that there's no racism. Black people are crazy. They just want handouts. But she herself sued her education. I think it was, I can't remember. I think it was Howard. I don't remember the school, to be honest, because I don't pay much attention to her. But she actually sued her university for discrimination, saying that they were discriminating against her because she was Black. It's ridiculous how quickly they turn the tide just to get what they want. It's self-serving is what it is.
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Hypocrisy that we continue to see where, I guess it's my joke to myself is don't believe your lying ears and eyes. My God, folks, we got tape.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's exactly right. And so what we'll do is for those of you listening who are interested, we will fully reference that NPR interview that Henri is mentioning. And of course, I'm sure most folks have either heard or can go find the initial interview after Biden's comments this week to hear the response. So, and Henri, I really value you surfacing the NPR interview because I hadn't heard that. And so, as I sat listening to him the other night, I certainly just thought to myself, I just don't understand how anyone could sit there. And yes, in my head, I thought, especially a person of color, and assert these things when all the evidence, certainly that I can at least, understand all the evidence that I have, right? And I think we all have our own evidence, but of course it's completely the opposite of what he said. And so to listen to him was discouraging, and it made me angry. So I appreciate knowing that I can go now and listen to this NPR interview where he's in fact going to be saying the opposite. And then yes, to your point, that becomes such an important component for us as we consider who we're putting into office, right? Who we're putting into these positions, who are in the end making a decision. Because now I'm sitting here wondering, so how does he vote, right? Like, does he vote with his party? And that's what happens. And the NPR interview was just a personal thing. Like, how does he marry those two things, right? What he says and does for his party versus what he believes based on what you've said that he brings forth in that interview. So Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm very careful when I use this particular phrase I'm about to use, because I think it gets thrown around sometimes a little too easily. But I will say that this guy is a classic example of what we call a sellout. I have no doubt whatsoever that he votes for his party because that's what's benefiting him personally.
Yeah.
And that's what it is when you sell out your own people, an entire group of people to get what it is that benefits you. And there's no way you could stand on national TV and make those comments if you haven't already sold your soul. Like, yeah. That's just what it is. I will say though that I wasn't disappointed in that from him. That's not new from him. That's not surprising to me from him. I was disappointed to hear Kamala Harris say the same. That was disappointing. Yeah, and not surprising, unfortunately, but disappointing, because you ran off of a platform of being the first person of, first Black woman. Like, you embraced that. You were going around to radio stations, making interviews, trying to relate yourself to Black people. If this wasn't a racist country, none of that would have been necessary. You wouldn't have had to make that claim. You wouldn't have had to ride on that platform. You wouldn't have had to push that agenda of being the first Black woman to get votes and all of that. And it just goes to show that things we've said in previous podcasts about the people in power, that power is more important to them than anything. Sadly, not surprising.
I hear you, and I struggle with that. So I have two thoughts, one about Scott and then one about Kamala. I'll start with Kamala. I saw her I'm reading Obama's book. I'm in the last few chapters, of his book that he just wrote.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what literally comes across so plainly is that struggle between who he is and what he's trying to do in the country, and walk that fine line. And I think in her heart of hearts, she doesn't believe what she said, but she said what she said to walk that fine line. I think, like you, I wish she had took the risk and said what she really believed, rather than what she believed people needed to hear, i.e. white people, so they don't get afraid. But I hear you, and Obama literally owns a lot of this in his book, that struggle between doing what you inherently believe and it's right, and that balance. And talked about how a lot of times it was wasted energy, trying to really do that balance.
Yeah.
Talking about Scott, I like that term sellout, because I completely agree with he benefits. And and these are my words, but I've thought about this a lot in the world of tokenism, because I've been there. That tokenism where you're the only Black professional in the room with white people. And do you interpret that as they are going to accept me and let me go along with all the jokes and everything they're saying? Or am I going to be inherently who I am? And that's a struggle, because at that point you have to make a decision. And to me, he's made that decision. Like you say, I clearly, we could look at his record. He voted right along with all the Republicans, all the policies. He clearly made that decision that he sees some benefit of being the only Black person in a room of whites and going along with their policies. Yeah.
So that's interesting, Henri, because you're drawing a distinction between a person of color in a power position who is like, as you said, voting alongside the same voting path, if you will, of whites and policies with policies that are detrimental, right, to the population, not just Black people, because we've talked before in this podcast, and we will a little bit today about how many of those policies hurt, especially disadvantaged whites as much as they hurt people of color. But so that you're drawing a kind of a distinction between that person and a person, and you're using Obama as an example. I think you're you feel like you're including Kamala Harris in there. In other words, kind of as hoping that this is the case, right? That someone who knows who they are, knows what they believe, and yet is trying to find a ground on which they can kind of reflect and respect those beliefs, but also still be heard and still be believed and still be, and in other words, influence whites, right? In other words, if I come out of the gate and I'm too hardcore, if you will, on one side, that I'll shut people down and I won't have any influence at all. So where do I find ground where I have influence? I haven't, Obama's book is on my list. I haven't read it yet. I'm looking forward to it. But your comment about him saying what he learned is that it was wasted energy, because when you walk that middle line, you're in the end not having a significant influence, in the ways that you design. Go ahead, Melissa.
But here's the problem
I
have.
Personal experience of this. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Henri. That's fine. Go ahead.
Just to give you an example of this, I shared with you what I've been going through with the school board and the superintendent.
Yep.
And I don't know if I sent you the last letter I sent to the superintendent, because
no, I don't think so.
At some point it really dawned on me as I started to go through this process that while I'm in disagreement, I have to view her as an ally. And there was no benefit to me to continue this adversarial relationship with her. And so while I am still pursuing what I believe is my intention, to bring about a equal and a diverse process.
Right.
I also, in my letter, had to convey to her that I understand her struggle, and hopefully that she's used me as an ally in terms of bringing about what we all want to see in terms of the school district. And, and I guess it just reminds me at times when, you do have a cause, but you're not in the position to have the power to affect that cause. You have to find ways, the middle ground. Where are the allies? Where are the people that I need to work with, but still be true to my agenda? And I'm hopeful that maybe Kamala will come back around to some of that, as we talk about the George Floyd bill, something that she strongly supported.
The problem that I have with it is that they never seem to have a problem offending the disenfranchised side of the group, because you're tiptoeing around calling America racist because you don't want to offend whites, but you've offended pretty much every Black person that heard you say it. They never seem to care about the impact on us. They care about the impact on white America. And we have talked about that on this podcast, that is why we continue to spin our wheels and work in circles. It's because we continue to hold back. We continue to tiptoe around issues instead of tackling them head on. My problem is, okay, if you're not comfortable coming out the gate saying, yes, America is racist, how about you just not say either one? Because nobody asked you to. There are ways you can have this conversation without drawing that line in the sand on either side. And unfortunately, our politicians don't care enough to do that. Her included, Obama included, because the things that they do always tend to be like, well, we can't offend the whites. We can't upset white America, but Black America will be okay. Black America, we can say it. How do you think it made Black people in this country feel to hear the first Black woman of color, because I know she's not solely Black, but the first person of color to hold that office stand up and spit in the face of pretty much everything we've been trying to change in this country? Because as we keep telling the world, the first step to solving a problem is admitting that you have one. And what she did with her statement was saying, nope, it's not a problem. That's not the case at all. And it is the case. We can sugarcoat it all we want. America is a racist country that has been built on racist ideals, and that racism is embedded in every facet of American life. And until we say that, honestly, until we deal with that, we're going to keep spinning our wheels in this circle.
So
that's my thought.
No, and you are so correct. And I'm just struck by, and I know we said this in previous podcasts, to be cautious when we say they and them, because you don't want to group everybody, because I agree with you, and there are.
Well, I'm speaking of people in power. I'm speaking more so of the people in power who have spoken out against this, spoken up in regards to these issues.
But there are some who are. Cory Booker has been very clear with where he is at in terms of where America is at. There are some politicians who are very clear. It's just not enough for them. It's just not enough.
Which is why we've clarified, though, that when we say they and them on this podcast, we're speaking collectively in terms of the majority and not all inclusive. So when I say they or them, it's the same as when I say whites or I say Blacks. We've said it before. We're not speaking that every single person in the group thinks or behaves or believes that way. I'm speaking of the collective, of the majority.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm going to add to this, because what's fascinating is you take that, right? You take the comments made this week that would, try to make an argument that racism doesn't exist. It's all fine. And you juxtapose that against the statement that the CDC came out with this in the last couple of weeks, right? Early April, I guess, about racism being a serious public health issue, right? And so in it, I'm going to read just a couple of quick lines. In it, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, of course, from the CDC, talks about how obviously we've known for months and months and months that the data is showing that populations of color, people of color in this country, are being far, far more impacted by COVID-19 with respect to rates at which they're being infected, rates at which they're dying, et cetera. But she says specifically, and this is where the CDC comes out, that the pandemic didn't cause these disparities, that it simply illuminated inequities that have existed for generations and revealed for all of America, a known but often unaddressed epidemic impacting public health, and that's racism. And she goes on to say, what we know is this: racism is a serious public health threat that directly affects the well-being of millions of Americans. And as a result, it affects the health of our entire nation. And she clarifies, much like we have in this podcast, Kendi does in his work, so many others have, that racism is not just the discrimination against one group based on the color of their skin or their race or ethnicity, but the structural barriers that impact racial and ethnic groups differently to influence where a person lives, where they work, where their children play, and where they worship and gather in community. These social detriments of health have lifelong negative effects on the mental and physical health of individuals and communities of color. So you juxtapose those statements, right? And we're talking about, in both of these cases, politicians who are using a platform and with different motivating factors, I think we're kind of saying, but with the same impact. And Melissa, I think your point is so well taken with respect to, even if you're even if you're more kind of positively or purely motivated because you're just trying to not shut whites out because you know you're going to need them, right, in order to get some stuff done. Even if that's your intention, it's not kind of, I hate to say it, I don't hate to say it, it's not more vile along the lines of Scott with respect to really intentionally trying to also be a part of the racist ideas and structures that keep people of color down. But even if you have that more positive intention, what we're hearing from the CDC is that regardless of what you think, right, this is happening. But to your point, Melissa, when you make those statements, are you considering the impact of them then?
Exactly.
On people of color, right? So you might be welcoming whites in, but what are you doing to the population who see themselves in your words and feel betrayed, right? As a result.
And not only feel betrayed, but it makes us question whether we'll ever see change. Mm-hmm. Because if you're saying, if the CDC is saying racism is this huge problem and it's impacting people, and then you stand up and say, we're not racist, America's not racist, then where does the change even start? Like, where do we even begin if you're not admitting that there is a problem? And I think that there were ways to have said it. And I understand, everybody's human. And I don't know if she just spoke without thinking or if she just felt this need to respond somehow. But at the end of the day, you're holding one of the highest offices in the land. You can't be that careless. Yeah. It's just not okay for you to be that careless. And that's what lends us to believe, when I say us, I mean all of us, to believe your words can't be trusted. Yeah. Because it's almost ridiculous. Like, to stand up and say, even if you didn't want to claim the country was racist, absolutely have a problem with race in this country that needs to be addressed. Right. I would have been fine with that. Yeah. Say America's not racist, you've now given credence and power to all those people who say that there's no problem. And then how do we fix the problem now said doesn't exist? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think those are important pieces. And, I had this thought as you were talking, and then it's not even, we don't even have to make a transition to this chapter. This chapter is, all wrapped up in all of this, and I hesitate to say this because it might seem like, I don't know, too superficial, but maybe it won't. So my daughter got me into watching the show, Madam Secretary, right? And Henri, I'm going to come right to you after this. Madam Secretary. And it's a, show about exactly that, right? It's a drama on whatever channel. And the main character is a woman who is the Secretary of State and goes on over the seasons to eventually become the president in the last season. But there's this great scene in the last season where her chief of staff, who has been the chief of staff for the president before her, is trying to coach her on what she should be doing, how she should be, operating as the president, how she has to think about decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this great scene where she finally understands herself and looks at him and says, the people of this country elected a woman for a reason. And the reason is because the way men have done it for hundreds of years has gotten us to this point, which doesn't mean all men are bad. It just means that they know and understand that someone who is thinking differently has to do this job differently. And I'm going to do this job like a woman. I'm not going to do this job like a man. And I can't help but think about that in this conversation where it's, is it time and can we have, people of color who are doing their jobs in those positions as a person of color and feel like they can actually get the work done. Henri, go ahead.
Oh no. I'm just kind of reacting to everything you're saying and kind of preaching to the choir.
I know. Yeah.
Well, the CDC stuff. Well, as you know, my degree is in public health. When I went to school, almost everything we looked at in research had to include some element of, and how does it affect people of color? And you clearly always saw the disparities, the inherent systematic racism that has affected almost anything and everything that we deal with. I agree with you, Melissa. I have always believed that we live in a racist country. I've experienced it. I've seen it. I read about it. I've read the research. The dilemma for me is, what are you going to do about it? And that's the struggle I see with these elected officials who try to walk the fence.
Yep.
I take the position, some of the people that I listen to, of, even though we elected you, we are still going to hold your feet to the fire, because that doesn't mean just because you're a Democrat or you're somebody who says you're going to do certain things mean they're going to happen.
Yeah.
And, that's about accountability. But I want to loop this back to the chapter, because I really think everything we're talking about, if you look at this chapter, what he's saying is this whole system is built on a lens of looking at life through whiteness.
Absolutely.
And if you look through that lens, then everything we're saying makes sense. Not that we have to agree with it or we're saying it's right, but it certainly makes sense when that is the standard, and everything else is being evaluated by that standard.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Henri. And as we're getting into the chapter, then I'll go ahead with the quick definition at the start, like we do each time. And the one definition he offers us right at the start, excuse me, is the definition for anti-white races. So the chapter is chapter 10 of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the chapter is titled White. And he defines anti-white racist as one who is classifying people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, or conflating the entire race of white people with racist power. And it kind of gets a little bit to what we've said all along, Melissa, you've emphasized before, which is that we can't, and Henri, you have too, we can't group everybody, right? The them and the they isn't every single person in that group, right? But the chapter is interestingly really about his personal experience with trying to understand whites, really, as he puts it, right? Understand how it could be possible that this group of people has done and is doing, continuing to build structures in a system that keep populations of people of color down, right, on a hierarchy. And so it's his own struggle with it. And I'm really interested rather in hearing your responses and your own experiences, because this man gets to the point where he says he had bought in temporarily as a college student to the belief that whites are aliens. Like literally aliens, not as an analogy for something else, but literally aliens, because that's the only thing that could explain what he sees in the world around him. And then, of course, he goes on and proceeds from there. So, Henri, you started us off, but where do you guys want to take it?
Well, I agree with him sometimes. Like I said last week, that sometimes my head wants to explode when I listen to I'm going to call it the spin that is made to justify the ridiculous thing that you're hearing, or that's being said, or the things that's overlooked. As we were talking, and this week, our niece, posted something about ACE, the adverse. And I quickly reacted to that, because it's like, that's all true, but what about racism?
Yeah.
I mean, how can we think about childhood trauma and not include the aspect of racism just based on what you just read from the CDC, and how that permeates and affects everything that happens to your life? Where you go to school, where you live, the doctors you see, the experiences, the social interactions you have. And I sometimes when I listen to people try to justify, no, that did not happen, no, that isn't occurring, no, those systems aren't in place, and we have the data and the research that supports this, that's where I agree with them. It's like, what's wrong with you, white people?
For me, it's and I own that, like 100%. That's a struggle I still have as well, Henri. And the reason I have the struggle, though, is that you see this on such a large scale. It's global. Anti-Blackness is global. It's not just in the United States. We often speak about the United States because that's our lived experience, but anti-Blackness is global. You go to any continent on this planet, and the hierarchy has people of color at the bottom of the rung, and the darker those people are, the worse the conditions. Even in places like India, where pretty much everybody is a person of color, pretty much. I mean, they have fair-skinned Indian, actual Indians over there as well. But even in India, where you would think color would be celebrated, color is not. Like, the darker you are, the worse you're treated, the less benefits you have. I mean, the whole nine. So when you start to see that this is global, it makes it harder for me at times, because I mean, I'm not constantly running around saying, white devils. I don't believe that. But it does make you wonder where the difference lies. Like, why is it that on an entire planet, whiteness is the standard, whiteness is the goal, whiteness is the dream, and anything less than is mistreated? And so it does lend you to that mindset that there's got to be something about white people that has created this situation and allows it to continue to foster. And so that is part of the struggle for me, in becoming quote unquote anti-racist. Although I keep wanting to stress this, and you said it, Janice, it's not racism against whites, which is what so many people want racism. Blacks can be racist to be. They want it to be blacks can be racist against whites. And I don't know of anywhere in the world where that's the case, where white people are the victims of racism, because racism is about the structures and the systems and the policies. At least when you're speaking of it in that way, white benefits all across the globe.
Well, what he's talking about, though, it's so true, Melissa, and you've been we've been consistent about that since last summer when we first started having this conversation as parts of the podcast. In this chapter, though, what he does introduce, and I want to hear both of your thinking about this, because he does introduce this idea of anti-white racist. So here's what he does, I think is important. At least it was important for my own learning. He distinguishes anti-white racist ideas and racist ideas, period, with racism, right? Because to your point, he says racism is the policies and the structures and the things that are designed to keep a race down, right? Whereas, but he says, but you can have racist ideas and racism. He actually distinguishes between them. So he does in this chapter talk about his own thinking, his own progression, and he calls it out as anti-white racist ideas, right? So your point is well taken, that there's not anti-white racism because there's not a power structure behind that, like you said, resultant, but that there are anti-white ideas, racist ideas. But he also goes on, and his kind of, for me, his big reveal is that the support of those ideas, the history behind those ideas, and he gives the history from hundreds of years ago and how the white population was even created, like all of that, like those same kind of ideas about whites that have been fostered around blacks that again all dispelled when we in the 90s proved that there's no biological difference between us from a genetics perspective. But he talks about how that encouragement of anti-white racist ideas is a part of the larger agenda to keep the Black population down, because those anti-white racist ideas feed a certain group of people. And then he goes into the history of white supremacy. And so it gets a little bit complex, because it's like anti-white racist ideas that actually are anti-Black, because in the end, when you circle them all the way around, this is where they end up. And I had to read it several times in order to kind of follow the chain. But so anyway, so that distinction for me was important, because you're right, there are plenty of people out there who try to make that argument, and certainly white supremacists are the leaders of it, that Blacks are racist against whites, and he really kind of distinguishes that for us. I'll stop there so you guys can chime in.
Well, I just wanted to say that we talked about this a little bit in a previous chapter about overcorrection, and that's what that is. That's overcorrection. When you've grown up your entire life thinking that blacks are inferior. And then you start getting information that, okay, this isn't true, this isn't correct. We've been here since the beginning of time. Oh my goodness, we were scientists and doctors and lawyers before they, made us slaves and pillaged the continent of Africa. Then it becomes overcorrecting to start thinking, we talked about all blacks are kings, all blacks were queens. No, we weren't. There were plenty of us that were peasants, but that's that overcorrecting idea. And so when you go from, when you go to the point of hating all white people, and when he spoke about the journey of Malcolm X, and I mentioned that in previous podcasts as well, that was my defining moment when my hero can say, yeah, I was wrong.
Yeah.
It's not all white people. It's not. And hating all white people is not the way to go. It is a journey, but it's overcorrecting and then finding your lane. That's what it is.
It's actually, it's interesting. This actually reminds me of what we're seeing in the current, pronouncements or messages you're hearing in the media. Even Senator Scott attempted to do this. If you go back and you listen to his speech, there was a part in his speech where he tried to juxtapose how whites are taught now versus 100 years ago. So, 100 years ago, you were taught to think, Black people were terrible, blah, blah, blah. And now the message is, if you're born white, you automatically are being seen as racist, and so somehow he's trying to shift this thought process that just by nature of being white, you are now being labeled as in that camp of being racist and anti-Black. And what a spin to put out into the population.
Absolutely.
Where its true intent is to support, the racism against people of color by somehow implying that, just by nature being white, you're going to be categorized as racist. Well, we know that's not true. Oh my goodness. And just based on what we just said, there are some people who do believe those things and will act on those things being in positions of power, but not everybody believes that way. And racism is, you're not born a racist, you're not a racist just by nature of the color of your skin. You become racist by nature of what you believe and what you're taught and how you behave.
That's exactly right. And it kind of, it tags right into Henri, right? His message from earlier chapters, which is that we can all be racist. And that frankly, if you've been raised in this country, unless you're working to be anti-racist, right? That your everything you know and understand from history to your experience in the culture and the society, etc., has messaging that is absolutely anti-Black, right? Anti-people of color, whether you're Black or not. We talked about this last week's episode, that this idea that when we talked about, it wasn't last week's, it was a couple weeks ago, but I was just listening to it again. The episode on color, where, within the population of people of color in this country, there are shades and degrees of Black, and you can be racist to people. I can be light-skinned Black and be racist to somebody who's darker skinned, and vice versa, just like I can be white like I am and be more or less racist towards someone depending on the scale of color, right? On the scale of color. So he goes into, one of the things I think is important about this chapter is that he really is hitting home this idea of racist power. And we started the episode with this, right? This idea of racist power. And what he says that, so he has a few quotes in here that I want to spotlight at some point because they just really hit home. He says that racist power, hoarding wealth and resources, has the most to lose in the building of an equitable society. So the people who are in racist power have the most to lose. As we've learned, racist power produces racist policies out of self-interest and then produces racist ideas to justify those policies. But racist ideas also suppress the resistance to policies that are detrimental to white people by convincing average white people that inequity is inequity is rooted in personal failure and is unrelated to policies. Again, this cycle of dysfunction where as long as we make people believe that when they don't have what they think they should have, it's because of their own personal failure, racist power continues to thrive. As long as we continue to distract them from the policies and the systems that are designed to keep a few, right, a small percentage in power with all the wealth, then the system continues to thrive because we've distracted them, right? On some level, it makes me wonder about, thinking in terms of Scott's comment and Harris's comments from earlier this week and the reaction that we're having to them. On some level, it's a great example of being distracted, right? If I'm distracted by that conversation, I'm not paying attention to what's happening right here in my community and doing what I can to do about that. Anyway.
I'll give you another, what I think is a great example of what you just said, affirmative action and college.
Yeah.
And if you remember, there was this whole push about how this was against white people. And there was actually lawsuits of how affirmative action and how, let's just say, trying to level the playing field in terms of college admission was seen as racism against white people.
Yeah.
And so in the end, what happens is Pell Grants go away, federal grants go away. The fiscal ability of these people who were the most affected by this policy now have to go out and get these huge loans to go to school.
Yeah.
And now we see this whole, backlash of people in huge amounts of debt going to college. But in my words, the original intention of undoing this was thought to maybe undo the benefits to people of color going to college. But think about the poor number of whites who also got caught into that net, who also are having large debts going to college, who also are not getting the benefits of, these Pell Grants and educational opportunities. So here, another example of how policy meant to hurt one population or disenfranchise one population has an effect on everyone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And he does, remember too, that when he talks about affirmative action, early on in the first couple of chapters, he says it is designed to give Black people an advantage, and it needs to be designed to give Black people an advantage in order to get us to a balance. And then once we get to a balance, then we can talk about, considering that we don't need those kinds of laws, et cetera. But I really appreciated that as a white person, because so often you hear people say, well, it's reverse discrimination, and we've dispelled that term a long time ago. But this idea that no, we actually do need some policies that do favor Black Americans, people of color in this country, until that's going to be a part of the solution, right? Is being willing to say, we have to actually lift this group up intentionally, not by accident, right? And to your point, he says later on in the chapter, he specifically says, white racists don't want to define racial hierarchy or policies that yield racial inequities as racist. To do so would be to define their ideas and policies as racist. Instead, this is to your point, Henri, instead they define policies not rigged for white people as racist. If it's not intentionally rigged for white people, then it must be racist. And I think that's a point that we all have to think about. Every time we hear a politician start to say, oh, it's going to benefit only Blacks or only whites, that should be an alarm bell in our heads, right? We should be really paying a close attention.
Yep. And that's what I think that's the problem. And that's the problem I had so much with the way what we were talking about on the podcast. The reason why we do this over and over and over again is because nobody wants to admit Black people are disadvantaged or people of color are disadvantaged. So when you start talking about giving them an advantage, and a lot of people's, we're even because they don't want to admit we're disadvantaged. So if we're both even, and now I'm giving an advantage to people of color, then all of a sudden that's unfair to me, because you really take a look and admit and own the fact that they're not starting at in the same place. We're starting years and years and years and generations behind. So giving us an advantage brings us to the same spot you're at. Then we can play the game fairly. Then you start to understand, giving them the advantage isn't a problem. So for me, it's the same thing with America is not It's denying that we have to do something to fix the problem before we can solve the issue. Like we have to bring America to the even point, and then we can move ahead. If not, that's the part that I think is so all over the place, I guess, is that we aren't admitting the problem. We aren't admitting that there's inequities, and until we do, we're going to keep spinning that wheel. Like I think back, really quick story, years ago, probably almost 20 now. I was reading the hometown newspaper. I was living in South Carolina, but I was reading our hometown newspaper, and there was this guy with this diatribe about how BET was racist. BET and the Black Miss America pageant. And I wrote a rebuttal that the reason it sticks out for me is my grandmother cut it out and saved it and was so proud of me. But I wrote this rebuttal about how those things wouldn't need to be in place if Blacks saw themselves already. Yeah. If I could turn on my TV and see myself, I wouldn't have to create a channel to see myself. If I could win Miss America and get those scholarships and all of the money and advantages and opportunities that come with it, I wouldn't have to create my own. But when we create our own, we're deemed racist for trying to play the same game with the same tools and opportunities as everybody else. Absolutely frustrating.
Yeah. And
so,
go ahead, Henri.
No, I was just going to say, this discussion, literally makes me think about, I keep going back to this idea. And I heard somebody say it's almost anybody in the Republican Party who continues to do what they're doing is based in these beliefs. Another great example, let's go back to FDR, and his whole social contract in America, sure, which was meant to benefit everybody, public housing, Social Security, this evolved into Medicare, Medicaid. And why now all of a sudden we have a problem with these things? And I suggest it's because it's the perception now that Black people are the ones who are getting the benefit from these social programs. And so we continue to see these cuts and we want to do away with these things. But if we look at the data, there are huge amounts of white people who are also being harmed by these reductions and these cuts in these social safety net programs based on the perception that, only Black people are benefiting from these things. We need to cut back and do away with these things. And again, to me, that's that whole idea of policies and this warped idea of trying to sell this idea of zero sum, well, if they get something, we get nothing, or the idea that, as you said, policies that give the perception that they benefit Black people then aren't any good because they're racist and not benefiting white people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I want to, if it's okay with you guys, because I think this part's important to get to before we have to wrap up, because so this whole chapter is a conversation, right, about thinking, again, in part very simply to the point that Melissa, you again reiterated at the start of this episode, which is the whole they and them, and not universally cataloging any one group. And he dives really deeply into the differences, if you will, between being anti-white, between being racist, between racist ideas and policies and racist power, rather, and all the pieces. All of that leads him to, and part of what he's doing is creating an argument for people to understand what you were just talking about, Henri, which is by fighting some of these policies that we seem to get people on a bandwagon to fight because the mantra is that they're benefiting Blacks. In fact, he refers to the mantra that was, on billboards, et cetera, back in, like 2013, right? The big billboards across the country that stated anti-racist is a code word for anti-white. So what he's done for us in this chapter is unpack that to help people really see and understand that is one more manipulation, if you will, of our understanding of the system as it really is. So he very specifically, it's not a surprise, and he goes into white supremacy. And so very quickly, I just want to highlight a few of the points that he makes about white supremacy, because I think that you know, in our country we have people who have varying degrees of understanding of white supremacists, right? When we think white supremacists, we think people are out there. You know, the first thing that comes to my mind is like Charlottesville and people who are, you know, on that campus and all the things that went with that. I'm not going to go into detail, and certainly, of course, most recently January 6th. But here's what he clarifies for us from a historical perspective. He says the mantra white supremacists or white supremacists are the ones supporting policies that benefit racist power against the interest of the majority of white people. And here's how he backs that up. He says, for example, white supremacists claim to be pro-white, but refuse to acknowledge that climate change, as an example, is having a disastrous impact on the earth that white people inhabit. They oppose affirmative action programs despite statistics that show that white women are the primary beneficiaries. They rage against Obamacare, even as statistics prove that 43% of the people who gained life-saving health insurance from 2010 to 15 were white. They hail Adolf Hitler's Nazis, even though it was the Nazis who launched a world war that destroyed the lives of more than 40 million white people and ruined Europe. They wave Confederate flags and defend Confederate monuments, even though the Confederacy started a civil war that ended with more than 500,000 white American lives lost, more than any other American war combined. White supremacists love that what America used to be, even though America used to be and still is teeming with millions of struggling white people. White supremacists blame non-white people for the struggles of white people, even when any objective analysis of their plight primarily implicates rich white people as being the core, if you will, of all of those things. So I think, so he finalizes that statement with white supremacists. Really, when you look at the history and the data, white supremacist is code for anti-white, and white supremacy is nothing short of an ongoing program of genocide against the white race. And I just think people need to hear that, right? I think that people need to understand it that deeply, not just kind of superficially, like we see reported in the news and the stories we hear, but really deeply understand how groups of people who are doing those things, in the end, to your point, Henri, that you've been so consistent about, are really supporting policies and actions that actually only hurt whites. And frankly, I gotta say, I'm not so sure many of them understand that. I really am not so sure.
I agree with you.
Yep, I agree.
And I think that is the crux of the problem, that people either they don't see it or they don't want to see it.
Yeah.
Because if you did, it's so hard to then continue with this belief that you have, you know. I mean, it's just so profound when you think about it. And just as you rattle off those statistics, you know, I was thinking about a study they did early on in the Affordable Care Act. And they go into these areas and they want to poll people, and they talk about that they like the health benefits and the you know, the things that they're receiving. And yes. As soon as they said Obamacare, all of a sudden, oh no, we don't want, you know. And so what is that simply about? But, you know, the idea of a benefit that is perceived to be attached to Black people or benefiting Black people.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago, right? That from the moving forward, if you're listening to this podcast right now and moving forward, you've never done this in the past, every time you hear whether, and I say politician, and we might think of immediately at the federal level or even the state level. I'm even talking about your local levels. Anytime you hear one of them saying a particular policy is only going to benefit one group of people, I don't care which group, that should be an alarm bell. You should be digging into that, because in my mind, that is rhetoric that basically is should be the ringing of the alarm bell that, hold on a second, if you're taking this position, then you either don't understand yourself or you're trying to influence me to behave a certain way. And why is that? I need to understand where that's coming from.
Well, just think about, and this week, the Florida governor, I don't know if he said he's going to sign it. You know, Florida just did what Georgia did, you know, suppressing the vote, doing away with drop boxes and early voting. And when you listen to the spin of why they're doing this, voter suppress, voter fraud, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, it's really meant to suppress the vote of Black people. Yeah. But let's think about it. It's not just Black people's votes that are being suppressed, and yet folks are not awoke and are somehow not seeing the total or the larger impact, as we've been saying. Affirmative action helped a lot of white women.
Yeah, that's right, which is why I wanted to read off those statistics, because I think those are the things that are important for us to consider. So be thinking, if you would, you guys, about your kind of closing piece, and especially as to the extent that it includes action. I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of suggestions for our listeners of actions they can take this week, and I'm going to come to Henri, and then I'm going to go to Melissa to wrap us up. So my two actions are really reflections. There are two different quotes that Kendi has in this chapter. One is a common one, if you will. Another one is just something he says that seems absolutely kind of one of those, yeah, of course, kind of statements. But so I'm just going to ask our listeners to reflect on both of these. The first, he says, that you've likely heard before is, and he's talking about his own, again, his own journey in trying to understand whiteness and understand why whites do what they do. But he says, he's talking about his own level of courage and the courage that it takes to do this work and this learning. And he says, courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to do what is right in the face of it. And he says, as this anonymous philosopher tells us, some of us are restrained by fear of what could happen to us if we resist. In our naivete, we are less fearful of what could happen to us or is already happening to us if we don't resist. Which takes me back to, we kind of had a little bit of this conversation last time about protests, and Henri, you sent us a great podcast about that we kind of started with here again with kind of the what protests can accomplish. But I just think that having everybody who listens to this think about why they do or don't resist in any way that takes shape for you, right? In your own home, in your own community, in your church, within the context of your family. When you don't resist, and yet what's happening isn't right or okay, then reflect on the kind of why and that level of fear, and his saying that in our naivety we are less fearful of what could happen to us or is already happening. We don't just really hit home on this front. And then the second one, he says this again in his own reflection, because he went looking, right? He did a historical a dig on why white people are the way white people are, and he got everything from the stories from the Bible that suggest that white people were created as monsters in order to avenge, and obviously he dispels that all the way up to the point where he says they must be aliens, right? So but he says, kind of as he's finally kind of coming around in his reflections, he said, I was thirsty. In this case, he says, for biological theories. That's what he was looking for, until, of course, that was all dispelled. But he says, and yet how we frame the problem and who we frame as the problem shapes the answers we find. It's that reminder that when we go looking, how we frame the problem dictates the answers we get. So if the questions we're asking already suggest a certain answer, we're going to find information to support that, right? And we have to be hyper aware and vigilant of that when we come to conclusions. And it's why I think that it's so important that when you study, right, when you do a study of something, that your analysis can be turned over to someone else. And I'm thinking about that even informally in my day-to-day life, right? To turn this theory over to someone else to say, okay, here's what I found. What do you think? Because without doing that, without having somebody else lay eyes on it, it's easy to find what you went looking for, and to support the beliefs that you have, and trying to step away from that and be hyper aware of that. So my calls to action this week would be reflections on those two ideas. Henri, coming to you next, friend.
All right. So a couple of quick things. So Tejan Thomas, he's the gentleman we started talking about. Yeah. He's he runs the Resistance podcast. Mm-hmm. Just as a side note, he was born in Sierra Leone. He's African. And he kind of talked, and it's kind of reminded me of the things we talked about earlier about body.
Yeah.
And he talked about his transformation of coming from Africa to America, and this belief, well, in Africa, Africans have a very different experience than they have in America, you know.
Yeah.
And he thought coming to America that he would have some of that same experience, like, well, you know, they'll know I'm African. And the wake-up call, his friend had this conversation with him. He says, look, Tejan, you know, when the police see you, they just see black. They don't see African Sierra Leone, you know.
Yeah.
And it just kind of reminds me of this whole thing about body, you know, and doesn't matter where you come from, if you're black, you're black. But something you said about this, he said in the book, you know, why do white people, why are they the way they are? And, you know, I've often thought about that. And, you know, one story that comes to my mind, when I was in elementary school, I've shared some of those experiences. I got bused over to the West Bronx. And as it turned out, one of my best friends, and, you know, we're still kind of untouched on social media, was Joel, who was a Jewish kid.
Right.
And he saved my life in a way. Maybe one day I'll tell you that story. But it was interesting. One day we had a conversation about his grandfather, who did not like Black people at all. And I said, Joel, you know, what is it? And because I go to his house, I spend the night there, I eat there, I had dinner with him, you know, I felt like I was part of the family, you know?
Yeah.
And he told me about one day, a long time ago, his grandfather was robbed, accosted by a couple of Black people. You know, they robbed him. And that one experience tainted him going forward, that from that point on, Black people were just no good.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I tell that story because it's something I said in earlier podcasts. Sometimes to me, it's about relationship.
Yeah.
And why are white people the way they are? And maybe if you ask them, well, how many people of color do you know or have you spent time with, that you ate dinner with, that you had a conversation with, that you asked difficult questions to? And maybe the way they are is because they haven't spent time to know anything different and have been indoctrinated in some of these racist beliefs that we've talked about, you know, during this podcast. So one thing I would leave people to think about is when we hear about policies and changes, you know, like these voting rights acts and things that are meant to take away or undo, think about, I kind of say, pay attention and listen to what is the true intention going on here.
Yeah.
You know, and is this really a policy to affect one population with some spin that is going to have a detrimental effect on many people? And I just say, be aware. You know, don't just accept things at face value, and look at what the true intention is. As we see with, as I mentioned earlier, the voting rights bill. There is no fraud. There is no reason to make it more difficult for people to vote.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I appreciate you landing on that example, Henri, because I think that's the one that's kind of been most in our face, if you will, since last November. And the idea that, you know, so many different organizations and entities, et cetera, have dug in to do the research to determine fraud, and it can't, and there has been none. And so and yet it's such a kind of a lie that's out there that people grab onto. And like you said, it becomes the basis for all these voter suppression, new regulations and rules, et cetera, that there's no need for, right? Because nothing has been proven. Melissa, go ahead and wrap us up.
Well, I had two thoughts, Janice, and you actually hit one of them. I had actually pulled up the definition to read it verbatim, but I don't think that's necessary now. And that's the idea of confirmation bias, of looking for things that support beliefs you already have, or interpreting information you come across to fit what you believe instead of challenging yourself and challenging your ideas. So I implore everybody to be very cognizant that that is something we can do, and making sure we don't do it. So when you're presented with an idea that makes you feel any kind of way, nervous, anxious, angry, upset, stop yourself and then go look for opposing opinions on to your beliefs, so that you have a clear view. And if you can still walk away feeling and believing the way you feel, then okay, I get it. But if all you're doing every time you go look for another opinion or do some research or have a conversation is to surround yourself with the same ideas, thoughts, and processes, you're not growing. And if you're not growing, we're never going to fix this issue. And that includes believing that there is an issue. Like, I don't know how anybody, as Henri said, can see data and completely disregard it. So I guess just being aware that confirmation bias exists and doing your part to fight against it would be my first. My second, and what ties back into what this chapter is all about, is for people to really re-examine their ideas and thoughts around whiteness, and to pay attention to how those ideas, thoughts play out in the world around you. I brought up the small, what may seem like the small issue of a Black channel, BET, Black Entertainment Television. But look at the rest of the channels in your cable network and tell me how often you see Black faces, or brown faces, or Asian faces, or Native American faces. Be aware of how whiteness is the standard, and then put yourself in the shoes of people who are not white, and imagine and think and have conversations, as Henri said, so that you get an idea of how detrimental and dangerous and harmful that is. Because until we step outside of our own experiences, we're not seeing each other. That's why we're able to think of they and them. That's why we're able to think that there are all these major differences, because we're not putting ourselves in the right positions to see each other as equals.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. I'm gonna give us a couple of quick little notes here. We referenced a podcast at the beginning, and the specific episode we started off talking about was for those of our listeners who are interested in this, Fresh Air, April 23rd, where they interview Tejon Thomas Jr., who is the host of his own podcast called Resistance, which I plan on going to listen to now after just listening to his interview. But in the Fresh Air interview, they do talk about this idea of kind of his own experience, again, in thinking through his position or his experience, right, with protesting racism in this country, and the extent to which he finds that influential, if you will. So that's a great one to listen to. We also referenced, of course, Senator Scott's comments in reference to Biden's speech this week. This is the week of April 30th, so as a point of reference. And then, of course, Scott's response, and then likewise Kamala Harris. You can find both of those online. All you have to do is Google those. And looking ahead then to next week, we're going to be delving into chapter 11 of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. This chapter labeled only Black, and the one definition he offers is at the start: powerless defense. So he wants to spend some time with us talking about what he refers to as the illusory, concealing, or disempowering and racist idea that Black people can't be racist because Black people don't have power, which we have touched on many times. I have not read ahead, so I have no idea what he's about to say. And I absolutely can't wait to discuss it with Melissa, Ellis, and Henri Williams. Thanks to both of you, of course, for your continuing support of this conversation and for being with us. And for everyone else, of course, like, share, subscribe. The more people who listen, the more people who can have a frame of reference for their own learning and digging deep. Thanks to all of you for listening. Of course, we'll see you next week, and we'll get to it.